To correctly expose footage in manual mode, you need to understand three main settings. These are aperture, ISO, and shutter speed. On screen, there's a couple alternate names that you may have come across if you're watching other tutorials. When we talk about exposure, what we mean is the brightness of the image. An overexposed image is too bright, an underexposed image is too dark. First, shutter speed. This is a measure of time. This is basically a door that opens and closes to expose the camera sensor to light. The longer the shutter door is open, the more light is able to reach your camera sensor. The shorter the amount of time the door is open, the less light is able to reach your camera sensor. When there's more light reaching your camera sensor, your image is brighter. When there's less light, your image is darker. Currently, the shutter speed on this video right now is 1/50th of a second. Let me show you what happens if I make the shutter speed faster and allow less light into the camera. The shutter speed is now 1/800, so less light is reaching the camera sensor. As you can see, the image is now underexposed. So what happens if we go the other way and we make the image too bright by making the shutter speed slower? I've now set the camera to 1/8 of a second. As you can see, the shutter door is now open for longer and the image is too bright. A secondary effect of shutter speed is that it affects the motion blur in the image. At the moment, I appear to be lagging and there is a lot of motion blur as I move my hand around the frame. As you increase shutter speed, motion blur is reduced. If we go to 1/50th of a second, there is still a large amount of motion blur, but it is pleasing to the eye. As I increase the shutter speed to make it faster, you can see how this affects the image and reduces the amount of motion blur in the shot. Next, let's discuss aperture. Inside your camera lens are aperture blades which create a small opening that allow light into the lens. The bigger this hole, the more light reaches your camera sensor and the brighter the image. The smaller the hole, the less light reaches your camera sensor and the darker the image. This is measured in f-stops. Currently, I'm at f5.6, but if I change the f-stop to make the hole smaller, you can see how this affects image brightness. If I now open up the aperture wider, you can see how the image brightness is affected. The hole is now larger and more light is reaching the camera sensor, so the image is brighter. When the hole is smaller, less light reaches the camera sensor. The secondary effect of aperture is how blurry the background is relative to the foreground subject. Currently I'm at f4 and you can see how blurry the background is relative to this camera lens I'm holding. I've now changed to f7.1 and you can see how the background is much more in focus. And remember, because the aperture is now smaller, less light is reaching the camera sensor, which has made the image darker. Finally, ISO. ISO is, broadly speaking, a measure of the sensitivity of your camera's sensor. A bigger number means a brighter image, a smaller number means a less sensitive sensor, and a darker image. It's more complicated than that, but this video is just intended to get you started, and the intricate nuance of that detail is not useful right now. If I turn the ISO up, you can see how the image is affected, and now I'm way overexposed. If I turn the ISO back down again and I reduce the ISO, you can see how the image has become underexposed. The secondary effect of ISO is as you reach higher and higher ISO numbers, you'll get more artificial noise in your image. It's complicated to say how much noise because it's very dependent on your particular camera and the particular sensor that you have. Generally speaking, you'll be aiming for a ISO number that is as low as possible. When using manual mode, the goal is to balance these three settings such that you can maintain the creative application where perhaps you want motion blur or you don't want motion blur, or you want a blurry background or don't want a blurry background, while being able to maintain a good exposure. For example, if you want a very blurry background, you may need to compensate with a higher shutter speed. Let's now go over some common beginner mistakes related to each setting. A common mistake with shutter speed is setting it in order to allow enough light into the camera to the point that your image becomes a motion blurry mess. A common beginner mistake with aperture is to always shoot with the most amount of background blur. It's not wrong to take photos and videos this way, but it's definitely not always appropriate, and you should definitely experiment with different apertures. A common beginner mistake with ISO is being afraid of an appropriate ISO. As you learn manual, you will lose good photos and videos to far too much noise. But if you're always afraid of cranking your ISO number, you're going to lose photos to underexposed, blurry messes. What you'll find is it's better to have a noisy image than no image at all. If you enjoyed this video, you're definitely going to want to check out my other content here, and don't forget to subscribe. Thank you for watching.